session of Humanity Rising as we convene our fourth of 5 sessions on a reconsideration, a reexamination of the pandemic and the vaccines that were used in a mandated way throughout the pandemic, not only in the United States, but in many countries around the world. We have been taking a risk because we didn't know what directives have been given to the algorithms. We are very pleased that after 4 days, we have not been compromised in any way with a discussion that only a year or 2 years ago would have been cause for immediate removal from YouTube and various other social media platforms. So I'm very grateful that the climate has changed with the Trump administration and with Robert Kennedy Jr. being appointed to the Health and Human Services Secretaryship, and that we all have an opportunity to reflect on what happened and why, and how we can better protect the health of our children, the health of all citizens as we move forward in a more informed way. I want to take a few minutes to summarize many of the different aspects that have come to light with Jessica Rose on Monday, and then Mary Holland on Tuesday, Jeffrey Jackson yesterday, as we begin our considerations today. By drawing on the work of Matthias Desmet, a professor of psychology and education at the University of Belgium, who wrote a book several years ago, which became an instant classic and bestseller, called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And I want to just very briefly summarize this because he brings into one, actually a very small little volume, which is I read as soon as it came out, what has basically taken place. And he uses as his model the extraordinary work, the classic work on totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt at the end of the Second World War. She reflected on the national socialism that was embraced by the German nation. And she and Professor Desmet point out the following characteristics of totalitarianism, which Desmet tracks in his book around what happened with COVID. It was a classic case of a conjuring up of a totalitarian situation in which the world found itself. And it has the following basic ingredients. Number one, the lockdown. The first principle of totalitarianism is isolation. The second principle is the cultivation of fear through controlled media that justifies the isolation because you need to be afraid of an enemy, in this case, the COVID-19 virus. And that gives rise to projection. And this is a classic psychological symptom among people who are uprooted through isolation, through manipulation of the media to be afraid. What begins to take place in the public mind is enemy projection. And that enemy projection is around anyone who's challenging what the government is saying. So after the isolation, after the fear, the enemy became anybody who was saying that this wasn't true. So you need to shut them all down. And that projection gives rise to what Carl Jung and Hannah Arendt referred to as mass hysteria. The isolation cuts you off. The fear enables you to blame somebody. Mass hysteria is that extraordinary phenomenon first observed by Carl Jung, the great psychiatrist in Switzerland in the 20th century, who lived through the Nazi phenomenon in the Second World War and wrote about it immediately after the war. That mass hysteria is that situation where people remain individuals and, by all accounts, rational, conventional, law-abiding individuals. But collectively, they engage in something that can only be described as insane. That's mass hysteria. And I thought it would be useful for us to contemplate Desmond's psychology of totalitarianism as it pertained to the pandemic and the vaccines, because he connects all the dots. And once you read his work and you contemplate on what you yourself observed happened, you'll see, as we have been contemplating, that this was much more profound an exercise than just simply trying to deal with public health. This was an exercise in totalitarian control. And when we understand that, everything else follows. And this totalitarian mechanisms can be applied to the German people in the 1930s, to the global public between 2020 and 2023 on a completely separate issue. It's a basic category of control that can be applied to different groups and in different situations, depending on how the governing elites choose to do so. We're all susceptible to it. And that's why it's so effective. So thank you, everyone. I want to welcome all of you to Humanity Rising, and with deep appreciation that we've all come together for this extraordinary conversation this week about an issue that affected us all.